Hi everyone. After almost a year of owning Tarot of Delphi, I am finally ready to talk a little bit about it. This is in relation how I have slowly discovered my way and my approach to reading tarot. I came across this deck for the first time or heard about it, I think about a year and a half ago, if not longer than that. Someone mentioned this deck as one of his absolute favorite. And when I discovered the aesthetic of the deck, I wasn't too impressed because I felt that it uses pre-existing historical, extremely well-known artworks that are in the public domain. And in that sense, to me, it felt a little cliche and unoriginal and therefore uninspiring. Somehow I came across one of the stories of the painting used for one of the cards. And as soon as I discovered the story behind the painting that has been used for that particular card and how that is associated to the archetype of that card, my mind was blown. And I realized that it hit something in me. It touched my own pre-existing way of seeking insight, that is through stories. When I was growing up, my father used to watch movies with me. He was a movie buff. I am too now, and I am too since actually, thanks to him. I learned how to speak English from watching movies. I have never been educated in an English language system until I came to New Zealand, and by then I was 18 and I went straight to university. So I purely learned how to speak English by osmosis. It is very much of a bottom-up process where I was thrown into the midst of something and I just pick things up and learn that way. I think it is also called learning a language by immersion. And so I quickly realized that I've gained insight about myself and about the situation I'm in, about the things around me, about others, and about my larger reality is through stories. My father would sit with me through movies that which complexity was way beyond my 8-year-old brain can understand. And he would sit there and slowly tell me not only what the movies were about, what the stories were about, or what the moral of the story was about as intended by the storytellers, but also the insights and lessons which he himself obtained from those stories in relation to his own life experiences and his own life circumstances at the time. And he would pass this on to me and say, you know, when you're in such and such position and you think this and you think that, remember that story of the eagle or the story of that hero, how he did this and he did that. And it became ingrained in me to learn wisdom from any stories, whether it's fictional or non-fictional, whether it's of my own stories or of others. And this then expanded into my wanting to understand other people's worldviews, their other people's perspective of their reality, because that's their story. And in reading here and even in the community, I find the most enriching, wisdom inducing and generation of insight has always been about other people's experiences, other people's shared experiences in the form of their life stories. And when I read the cards, when I see things through multiple decks, which is why I work with multiple decks since the very beginning, is you almost caught glimpses of people's internal worlds, shared internal worlds in the form of their expressions of the 78 cards. And this very much hit me on that spot where I suddenly realized that I do not read cards, I read the stories behind the cards. I read the stories behind the images on the card is what I'm reading. Without those stories, I can't read them. And so I think because of that, I always thought that I can't read intuitively, or I don't, because I don't pick up visual cues. I don't look at a picture, at colors, at shapes, at forms on the card, and I don't do free associations with those things and whatever come to my mind when I see those things. What I do is I always want to investigate. If there is no booklet, if there is no stories, if it's a simple Rider-Waite-Smith images painted by a deck creator or producer or an artist, I've always wanted to understand why they painted the Fool that way. Why have they painted or depicted the High Priestesses in a certain way? And the why and where they are coming from in creating that image is what I read. And so I have finally realized that now, 9 months on, with this deck, and why this deck have worked so well for me, and I think why this deck have worked so well for a lot of people. It's not because the art is beautiful, because there is another deck using the same pre-Raphaelite types of art like this, and in fact some of the images are the exact images here. And when I saw where those images sit in the on which of the cards in the tarot system, I couldn't connect with it, because they were connecting the images on the image level with the card. So if it's a star, then it's a picture of some kind of a star or a scene containing a star, and that's a star. If it's a high priestess, then there is an image very much like what a high priestess would look like, or what someone would be, or someone's conception of what a high priestess might look like, and that would be the high priestess. And you don't need a booklet, you don't need to understand the stories behind each of the painting to understand why that painting represents that particular card. Here, I believe, without understanding that this is Persephone, and without knowing the story of Persephone, I personally would not be able to, not that I can't read the card, but I won't be able to obtain the message, the wisdom, and the level of insight that I have been able to obtain from this deck again and again and again, because of how well the stories behind the pictures, behind the cards, represent the archetype of the card. And I think that is probably why also that some of us, or at least me, or some of us, or some of you who read the same way as I do, which is not to read the card physically or visually, but reading the stories and the message behind the picture, behind the cards. That is probably why we don't read reversals, because this is Persephone. If I reverse her, she's still Persephone. In fact, my window to her story become quite muddled now, because she's now upside down. It is a little bit like reading this book, for example. If I read this book like so, and if I turn it upside down, I am none the wiser, or I'm not going to be any clearer about what I'm reading. And so I read the cards the way I read books, the way I read stories. It's just that not in words, they're in images. And similarly, I think probably why the Thoth deck, Crowley's Thoth that is, not the other Thoth, is also not reversible. And people do read reversals with this, and I think you can read anything really. I mean, you can throw this ring and cast this ring into a little map and see where it lands, and then read that, right? You can read tea leaves, you can read I can throw this into a kind of diagram perhaps and see where it lands and read that. My point is that I'm not at all asserting or suggesting that what can or cannot be done. I am simply sharing with you why, how I read, the way I read, and why I read the way I read, and why others perhaps do the same. Like here, each of these are symbols. Each of them tell a story. This is the devil, and those are very much a phallic symbol with two testicular glands here. And so if you turn that upside down, those are still testicular glands, and those are still the phallic symbol. And so, and that's still a smiley goat with a third eye. You turn it upside down, it's still a smiley goat with a third eye. And I read the story behind that smiley goat with a third eye, with that amazing horn and that masculine reproductive organ clearly depicted behind it. And there is this Egyptian staff over here, which I am yet to understand. And so some of us, myself included, do not read the cards, but we read the message and the stories behind the painting on the card. We do not read the card itself, if that makes sense. And I think if we do read the stories behind the paintings on the cards, by that definition, we do not use free associations to read the artwork. For this very same reason why another deck that worked extremely well for someone like me, who reads like me, is the Urban Tarot. The Urban Tarot is basically a life story of Robin Scott, a beautiful, beautiful person, I believe, and who has been extremely open about her journey transitioning from Robert. And everything here, friends and family, these are her friends and family, this is her city, this is her thoughts, and the insights that she gained with creating each of the cards, about each of the cards. And she talks about how she created her journey in creating each card. She talks about the people in the card who modeled for her, who are friends and family. She talks about her experience with each cards, the insight she gained. It's very, very personal. And so, like here, the star, someone commented about how this is dingy and it's not exactly like the classic star you normally found in the Rider-Waite-Smith or even the Marseille. But if star is about hope, there is this gutter and there is this house, I think soup kitchen was housed there. It's a lot of charity work happens in that building. And in all this ugliness and dirtiness over here, one of her foot's there and she's reaching up there. It's the very definition of hope, is when you are absolutely in the gutter and yet you reach out for something better. And it's a story. That story is what I read in this card. It isn't, and when I turn it upside down like that, it doesn't make that story any clearer. But of course this is reversible, and I think that is a very wise commercial decision to make decks reversible, because if it's reversible, people like me don't have to reverse it. But if it isn't reversible, then people who want to read it as reversible might complain about it. In any case, going back to how we read cards, or how I read cards, reading the cards versus reading the stories and the messages behind the images on the cards, I think for that very reason, when we read the stories instead of the cards, we don't do reversal, or at least I don't. And until I shifted my approach to reading cards, until I go beyond the stories behind the paintings, behind the artwork on each cards, I think I will remain, I will not read reversals, because it doesn't add to the story, if that makes sense. Perhaps when my journey goes from gaining insights and wisdom for self-reflection and to get closer and closer to the source of all things, or the source of my own existence, perhaps when I move to reading the cards the way we read runes or charm casting, I perhaps remain I will perhaps stick to not reading reversals for as long as I read cards this way. But yeah, so I think finally I've become very clear to me why this is such a breakthrough deck for me. It's because it showed me that all this while I have been reading stories behind the paintings on the cards, and that I haven't been really reading the cards themselves, and that I haven't really felt like I've read quote unquote intuitively, because I don't read in a free associative manner. I do not look at an image and start free associating it with thoughts and feelings that occur to me as I look through the visual cues. And I think I'm okay with that. I think reading stories behind the paintings on the cards, I think, is a way to go for me. It has worked well for me so far. And I think this is probably why Tarot of Delphi works so well, and why other decks with the same visual and artistic theme doesn't work at all well for me. And my only hope is that there might be room for readers like me, and that tarot deck creators or deck creators would consider creating decks that tell stories, so that, because when we read decks, or when we read cards, you know, when we read stories in the cards instead of the card itself, it doesn't mean that we don't use our intuition. We do as well, but we use it in a different way. We don't use it in a free associative manner. And so that for those like me, for readers like me, I think more decks that are story based would be ever so amazing, because it really get our intuition juices going. It's just that the way our brain works, I think it needs to be anchored in shared stories, in stories that are shared by others, in the common denominator that is the human consciousness. And stories is such a beautiful, magical thing. So there it is. Thanks for listening, guys. Bye.